So, while overall Slash is the best damage type in the game, Toxin is better in some scenarios, mainly versus the Corpus. But why? Well, Toxin does to Corpus what Slash does to Grineer. It bypasses their primary defense. It actually does it even better than Slash. Because unlike Slash, which only bypasses Grineer armor with its damage over time, Toxin bypasses shields entirely. So even raw Toxin damage will go straight through them. Though this is restricted to non-boss enemies, you cannot bypass the shields of bosses. However, in addition to doing 50% more damage to Corpus flesh, which is fantastic, it also does 25% more damage to proto shields, which are the kind of shields that high tier units and bosses use. So even though you cannot bypass shields on bosses, you at least get a nice damage bonus. Though this does come at a cost. It does 50% less damage to fossilized infested, those are your higher tier units like ancients and broodmothers, 25% less damage to robotic type Corpus units, which are your moas and hyenas, and 25% less damage to Grineer machinery, which are basically just rollers. It's not a big deal though, because if you're gonna run Toxin, you're gonna run it against the Corpus. It's kind of pointless to try and run it versus the infested, because toxic ancients have an aura that nullifies toxin damage completely, and if you're gonna use it against the Grineer, you need to bring very reliable armor strip, as Grineer armor is the bane of Toxin. Now the reason Toxin is so strong is because of its status effect, which stacks infinitely and it poisons the enemy, dealing damage 6 times in 6 seconds. And this status effect scales way better than the Slash status effect. The modded base damage calculation on it is the same. It takes the weapon's base damage, multiplies it with base damage bonuses, which are your serrations, hornet strikes, point blanks and such, and then it multiplies it again with faction damage bonuses, so your cleanses, banes, smites and all that. The difference happens in the second half of the calculation, which decides the actual damage of the Toxin proc, because this takes 50% of the modded base damage as opposed to 35% that you get on Slash, so that's already way better, and multiplies it with Toxin damage bonuses. So putting on Toxin mods on a weapon where you want to do Toxin damage over time actually increases the damage of the Toxin procs, unlike with Slash, where putting on Slash mods doesn't increase your Slash damage over time. This is then multiplied by faction damage bonuses again, because faction mods double dip on damage over time, and we multiplied one last time with additional multipliers, which are crit and weak point hits. So not only are we multiplying a bigger base number, we also have an additional multiplier to play around with. This is why Toxin is infinitely better than Slash on weapons that don't crit very well, because Slash runs out of multipliers very quickly if the weapon can't crit, whereas Toxin, not so much. Now, one of the downsides of Toxin is that it synergizes really well with Viral, whilst also being one of the 2 elements required to create it. So under normal circumstances, you cannot run Viral and Toxin on the same weapon. So if you want to utilize Viral with Toxin, which is a great idea, you're gonna have to use a primer, so either a weapon, a Warframe, or a companion that's designed to proc Viral for you, or you're gonna have to use a special weapon that can proc its own Viral procs, like the Bubonico, which is actually one of my favorite Toxin weapons and one of the few weapons that I have set up specifically to shred Corpus in Steel Path. Now, if you watched the previous video in this series, or you know something about building damage in Warframe, you may have noticed that this is basically an example of what not to do, as we're running 2 base damage multipliers and 2 multi-shot multipliers. We're also double stacking Toxin, so it's like everything on this build seems wrong. But I have my reasons for it. I don't run crit or fire rate. Crit is kind of pointless if you're using the secondary fire, because it has a very low crit, and I don't like fire rate on the Bubonico. Plain and simple. This gives me the option to run Prime Point Blank to cut down on the pain of stacking Primary Merciless at the beginning of a mission or where it randomly drops, Tactical Pump for faster magazine recharge, and Vigilante Armaments for more multi-shot, which makes me stack status faster. The reason I'm explaining this is because when you understand why I did it, you can choose not to do it if you don't want to. Also, for the kind of content that I normally do, I could actually remove even more damage and it would still be fine. I tend to not build overkill damage just for the sake of it. I would much rather take some of it out and replace it with utility or quality of life. Now, this is actually a pretty unusual weapon, so let's look at something a little bit more straightforward. The duo Ichors. Toxin builds are actually even better on melee weapons because we have Primed Fever Strike, which is a much bigger multiplier than other Toxin-based mods. And the build is pretty straightforward. We have a bit of quality of life with Spring-Loaded Blade for extra range, we have Primed Fever Strike for a massive Toxin damage multiplier, Primed Pressure Point for a generic damage multiplier, Smite Corpus for a faction multiplier, Weeping Wounds for status so we can actually proc the Toxin, Berserker Fury for more attack speed, and we top it off with Organ Chatter and Blood Rush for crit multiplication. I think this is a fantastic example of how strong Toxin damage can actually be, because the Ichors are a fairly old weapon and their stats are decent, but it's nothing to write home about, yet they still absolutely destroy Steel Path level Corpus with a solid Toxin build. And that's without a primer, so we're not using Vital, which is a massive damage multiplier at all. So while Toxin is not as versatile as something like Slash, because that works against everything, it might not work as well versus the Corpus, but it still works, it's definitely the way to go if you're fighting Corpus. Also, most Toxin builds are not that far away from a gas build, so if you really want to fight the Infested with a build like this, simply put in a little bit of heat to turn the Toxin into gas, and then swap your faction mod from Corpus to Infested. And that's pretty much all I have for you today, so I thank you very much for watching. As always guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and if there's anything you would like to add to this, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you would like to become a channel member as well, by the way, you can check out the memberships and stuff down below. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.